In the first week of September 1942, Japanese officers stood on a ridge called Yoriwa in the mountains of Papua and wept. Men who had fought across half of Asia and the Pacific without a significant defeat in 18 months looked south through a break in the jungle canopy and saw what they believed to be the lights of Port Moresby. They embraced each other in the mud. They shouted Banzai. After everything they had spent to arrive at this moment, the disease, the starvation, the men left dead on the track behind them, they could see their objective. They were 50 kilometers from the city their commanders in Tokyo had sent them to take. Of the 6,000 combat troops, the Japanese South Seas Detachment had pushed across the Owen Stanley Mountains to reach that ridge. Fewer than 1,500 were still effective. More than 1,000 were confirmed dead. Thousands more had been destroyed by wounds and disease on the track from Buna. The formation that had swept through Guam, Rabaul and Singapore without a significant defeat had been reduced, on this particular jungle track in Australian territory, to this particular group of men on this particular ridge. What had done it to them was not a story Tokyo would ever willingly tell. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the 39th Battalion, the chocolate soldiers of Kokoda, before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about who saved Australia in the darkest year of the Second World War. Now let's go. To understand why a battalion of undertrained Victorian teenagers ended up as the only thing standing between a veteran Japanese invasion force and Australia's most critical base in the Pacific, you have to understand what Australia had already lost before the first shot was fired on the Kokoda Track. The speed of it was the thing that nobody had prepared for. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japan struck the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and opened a campaign of simultaneous landings across Asia and the Pacific that moved with a coherence and aggression no Allied commander had correctly anticipated. On the 23rd of January, 1942, 20,000 Japanese troops overwhelmed the 1,400 Australians defending Rabaul, the largest Australian base in the Pacific, in a single day. On the 15th of February, the fortress of Singapore fell to a Japanese force that had attacked through the jungle from the north, because the guns defending the harbour pointed the wrong way. 130,000 British and Allied troops surrendered, among them 15,000 Australians of the 8th Division. Those men had not been beaten in any ordinary tactical sense. They had been outmanoeuvred by a military that understood their own defensive doctrine better than they did. For Australia, the loss of the 8th Division was catastrophic in a way that went beyond the numbers. Those were trained, equipped soldiers who had deployed overseas as part of the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, the all-volunteer formation Australia sent to fight alongside Britain against Germany and Italy. They were gone. The Royal Australian Navy was too small to counter the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Royal Australian Air Force lacked modern aircraft in sufficient numbers to affect what was already unfolding. Japan was still moving, and the thing Australia had sent overseas to be the first line of its defence had just ceased to exist as an effective force. Japan could not, as it turned out, invade the Australian mainland. Imperial General Headquarters had determined by March of 1942 that the conquest of Australia was beyond Japan's means. The objective shifted to something achievable and equally decisive: isolating Australia from the United States by seizing the bases that made Australian territory useful to the Allied counter-offensive. Port Moresby, on the southern coast of Papua, was the primary target. Its airfields allowed Allied aircraft to operate against Japanese-held positions across the region. If Japan held Port Moresby, the Allied route northward was closed. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May blocked a Japanese seaborne landing at Port Moresby. The naval force turned back. midway in June blunted Japanese naval expansion in the Central Pacific. But Port Moresby remained the target, and Japan had found another approach. The Owen Stanley Mountains separated the northern Papua coast, where Japan held its bases at Buna and Gona, from Port Moresby on the south. A single track through the jungle, the Kokoda Track, crossed that range. An overland attack was not the obvious solution. After the Coral Sea closed the sea route, it was the only one available. The problem confronting Australia was structural and acute. Its best soldiers were in the Middle East and North Africa, fighting under conditions that would not release them quickly. Remaining at home was the militia, the citizen military forces, home defence troops legally restricted from overseas service, treated since the start of the war as second class by the AIF and by the public, and given consistently inferior weapons and training because the working assumption had always been that they would not need to fight. All New Guinea had been declared an Australian military district, a classification that allowed the government to send conscripts there on the legal basis that it constituted Australian territory. To the people who drafted the enabling memoranda, it was an administrative convenience. To the young men of Victoria who received their orders to report for embarkation, it was the beginning of something none of them could yet name. General Hori Tomitaro was born on the 7th of November 1890 in Hyogo Prefecture, Japan. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1911, commanded the South Seas Detachment since 1940, and carried a record before Papua that was unbroken: the capture of Guam in hours, the fall of Rabaul in a single day. In the months before Papua, he had issued a document called The Guide to Soldiers in the South Seas, which consisted of 5 instructions prohibiting his men from killing civilians unnecessarily, looting, or burning property without permission. The guide is unusual in its context. It reflects something about what kind of man Horii was: practical, plain-spoken, aware that armies that mistreat local populations create their own tactical problems. He kept his headquarters close to the front line and was respected by his men in the particular way that respect is earned rather than conferred. Before his force departed for the Buna landing, Horii expressed private reservations about the overland attack. He thought it would be extremely difficult, with a high risk of failure. His reasoning centered on supply, moving food and ammunition across 100 kilometers of mountain jungle with no road and no mechanized transport. He said so to the people who could have adjusted the plan, and then he executed it anyway, because that was what the Imperial Japanese Army expected of its officers when the plan had been approved above them. The Nankai Shitai numbered approximately 13,500 men at the start of the Papua campaign. Its core fighting units were the 144th Infantry Regiment and the 41st Infantry Regiment, backed by mountain artillery, engineers, and supply troops. Many were veterans of the Malayan campaign, soldiers who had fought in sustained operations across difficult terrain and understood the particular disciplines that jungle warfare demanded. They had not failed in any engagement they had yet attempted. The question was not whether they could fight. The question was whether the track across the Owen Stanleys would constitute an environment they could survive as well as fight in. Japanese military planners in Tokyo, studying their maps of Papua, had reason for confidence. A pre-war intelligence report prepared by an agent named Toyofuku had provided accurate maps of the Owen Stanley routes. Those maps could not communicate what the terrain actually was. Junior soldiers across the Nankai Shitai heard through informal channels that the route from Buna to Port Moresby included a vehicular road. The Owen Stanley Range was preparing a correction that would be paid for in blood. On the night of the 21st to 22nd of July, 1942, the advance echelon of the Nankai Shitai landed at Gona Mission on the North Papua coast, approximately 1,800 men under Colonel Yokoyama Yosuke. For the first time in Australia's history, its territory was under enemy invasion. Waiting for them on the track toward the mountains were soldiers their own intelligence had categorized as not worth serious concern. The phrase chocolate soldier had its origins in a play by the Irish dramatist George Bernard Shaw. The term described a soldier who would not fight, a man unsuitable for combat, too decorative to be trusted when things became genuinely hard. In 1942, it was applied to the Australian militia by the AIF and by the public, and it carried the same implication with the same confidence. These men would melt in the heat. They were also called koalas, not to be exported or shot at. In the military culture of 1942, the militia was something you tolerated and kept out of the way of serious soldiering. The 39th Australian Infantry Battalion was formed in Victoria in October and November of 1941, drawn from existing militia units across the state. It arrived in Port Moresby in January of 1942, less than 2 months after Japan entered the war. Their average age was 18 and a half. They came from Melbourne suburbs and Victorian country towns, bank clerks, farm workers, shop assistants, boys fresh from school who had joined the militia because the AIF required going overseas, and they, or their families, had reasons for not wanting that. They had seen what overseas service had done to the generation of 1914. They were not cowards. They were young men exercising a reasonable judgment that then required them to fight anyway. Their equipment was second-rate, because the best equipment went to the AIF. Some of their weapons were obsolete. They wore khaki shirts and shorts in a green jungle where the Japanese wore jungle greens. The khaki made them visible against the vegetation at distances where the jungle should have concealed them. Camouflage clothing arrived later in the campaign, after the men who needed it had already fought in what they had. The contrast with the 53rd Militia Battalion, the other major militia unit sent to Papua at the same time, was stark and damaging. The 53rd's officers treated their posting as something of a lark. The men dug holes, unloaded ships, and performed general labour around the port. The culture those officers established was one of men marking time, and it produced the performance that such a culture reliably produces. Napoleon is credited with the observation that there are no bad troops, only bad officers. The 53rd's men fought as their officers had prepared them to fight. The comparison with the 39th says everything about what officer culture does to a battalion, and nothing useful about the men inside it. Lieutenant Colonel William Taylor Owen was born on the 27th of May, 1905, in Ngambie, Victoria. He had worked as a bank officer in civilian life, survived the fall of Rabaul in January of 1942, as one of a small group of men who evaded Japanese capture and made it back to Australia by a route that required considerably more resourcefulness than bank work had ever demanded. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of the 39th Battalion on the 7th of July, 1942. He would have 22 days in command before he died. Captain Samuel Victor Templeton was born in 1900, in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. He had served in the First World War. He was the oldest officer in the battalion at 42, and he commanded B Company, the first Australians who would march north up the track toward the Japanese landing force, a First World War veteran commanding teenage militia boys on the first Japanese invasion of Australian territory, with obsolete weapons, in jungle none of them had trained in, against a force that had not lost an engagement in 18 months. The mathematics of that situation did not produce optimistic projections. They marched anyway, and they took with them soldiers of the Papuan Infantry Battalion, indigenous Papuans under Australian officers, who would prove in the coming weeks that they knew things about this country that no Australian yet understood. The Kokoda Track ran approximately 96 kilometres from Oa's Corner, the last point accessible by road from Port Moresby, to the village of Kokoda on the northern plains. The Owen Stanley Range is not a mountain range in any European sense of that phrase. It is a geological formation of extraordinary severity, a central spine of New Guinea pushed to heights exceeding 2,100 metres, with ridge lines that dropped into gorges and rose again without transition, without level ground, without any section of the track that was not either sharply ascending or sharply descending. Australian engineers later cut 3,500 steps into a single ascent near the village of Noro. That number, 3,500 steps carved by hand into one section of one hill, is the most economical description of what movement on the track required. Visibility through the jungle on either side of the track was often a matter of metres. The mud was not the mud of roads after rain. It was the accumulation of a jungle floor that had never fully dried, a substrate of rotting vegetation and saturated earth that swallowed boots and exhausted muscles, and turned a step into an effort that the body registered and did not forget. At lower elevations, heat and humidity produced the conditions for the diseases that would take more soldiers out of the fight than any bullet: malaria, scrub typhus, dengue, and dysentery. At higher elevations, the same men were cold at night without adequate shelter, wet through from rains that came without warning and stayed without apology, and hungry because the supply systems meant to feed them could not keep pace with what the track cost to walk. Supply itself depended entirely on human labour, specifically the labour of the Papuan men recruited as carriers throughout the campaign. Up to 16,000 of them served in total, approximately 3,000 active at any given time. They carried food and ammunition up and wounded soldiers down, on stretchers over cliff faces and through river crossings, shading injured men with banana leaves and finding local food when the Australian rations ran out. They came to be known among the diggers as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, a term that carried, beneath its colonial affection, a genuine acknowledgement of what the Australians understood clearly, that without these men, the campaign ended differently. This is not sentiment, it is logistics. The Japanese, who had mistreated Papuan civilians as they advanced, could not build an equivalent carrier system because the people who might have served them had fled or actively assisted the Australians instead. That asymmetry was as significant as any tactical decision made by either side on the track. On the 23rd of July, 1942, at a river crossing near the village of Awala on the northern edge of the track, Captain Sam Templeton's B Company made contact with the Japanese for the first time. They destroyed the wire bridge over the Kumusi River before the Japanese main body could use it. They identified approximately 50 enemy soldiers on the far bank, opened fire, killed several, and watched the survivors withdraw. It was a clean result, the right outcome from the first engagement, the kind of beginning that should predict the story that follows. It did not predict the story that follows. Hundreds of Japanese Marines began crossing the Kumusi almost immediately, using whatever means the river allowed. A company of 120 Australians was not going to hold them. Templeton pulled south toward Oivi and set a defensive position while sending for reinforcements that could not arrive in time. A small reconnaissance by Lieutenant Johnston and 2 other diggers penetrated the Japanese position around Oivi so completely that they found themselves standing among enemy soldiers who could not open fire without hitting their own men. The Japanese response, in this specific predicament, was to throw stones. 3 Australians, surrounded by some of the most experienced jungle fighters in the world, dodged rocks and found their way back to the Australian line in time to warn a C Company patrol heading directly into the same ambush, alerting them with a single shot that scattered the Japanese and killed 5 of them in the confusion. The small action purchased something more valuable than 5 Japanese dead. It purchased information. A company and D Company attacked Oivi simultaneously, sweeping through the Japanese positions from multiple directions. Those who escaped the assault ran into a prepared ambush on the exit route. The 2 companies accounted for approximately 200 Japanese dead. The Australians briefly held Kokoda. supply aircraft arrived overhead, circled the airfield, and turned back, unable to land safely within the perimeter the Australians controlled. Without supply, the mathematics of the position had a single answer. The withdrawal to Deniki continued. Captain Templeton had gone back toward battalion headquarters for reinforcements and had not arrived. He was captured near Oivi on the 26th of July, 1942, and taken before Lieutenant Colonel Tsukamoto. The account of what followed comes from testimony collected decades later from a Japanese soldier who was present. Tsukamoto interrogated Templeton about Australian strength and intentions. Templeton told him there were 80,000 Australians waiting in Port Moresby. Then he laughed. Tsukamoto killed him with his sword. Samuel Victor Templeton was 42 years old, a First World War veteran, a Belfast man who had made his way to the Victorian militia by the long sequence of small decisions that constitute a life, and he died on a jungle track in Papua, making the specific kind of gesture that only the very brave or the entirely reckless produce when held at sword point. Templeton's Crossing, the first point where the track from Port Moresby crossed Yoriwa Creek, carries his name today. By the 28th of July, the fighting had reached the plateau at Kokoda and its airfield. Owen had arrived by air with approximately 77 men, 40 more held back at Deniki. He requested reinforcements by radio. 2 Douglas transport aircraft arrived overhead, carrying men from the 39th. They circled the field, concluded from what they could see that the Japanese had already taken it, and returned to Port Moresby with the reinforcements still aboard. At 2:30 on the morning of the 29th of July, the Japanese attacked. The defence Owen organised in those hours was effective beyond any expectation of what 77 men could accomplish. He was at the forward positions himself, at the most threatened points, throwing grenades alongside the men he was commanding. Lieutenant A.G. Garland, who was there, described him afterwards in the terms Combat Reduces Assessment 2. He was a fine man. He was in a forward pit with a grenade in his hand when a bullet struck him just above the right eye. He was carried back to the hut where the 39th's medical officer, Captain Geoffrey Vernon, had his operating table. Vernon was 70 years old. He performed surgery on Owen by lantern light, in a hut, while the battle he was treating casualties from continued outside. He could not save him. William Taylor Owen died on the table on the 29th of July, 1942. He was 37 years old. Australian losses at Kokoda: 7 killed, 6 wounded. Japanese: 12 killed, 26 wounded. A mist that came in without announcement concealed the Australian withdrawal to Deniki. In the first days of August, reinforced to approximately 430 men, the 39th attacked back toward Kokoda. A&D companies, sweeping through the Japanese positions from multiple angles, accounted for approximately 200 enemy dead. Supply aircraft circled with food and ammunition they could not unload safely within the perimeter the Australians held. They flew back to Port Moresby full. Without supply, the position could not be maintained. The withdrawal continued to Isurava. It was at Deniki, on the 4th of August, that Major Alan Cameron arrived from brigade headquarters, saw the battered survivors of B Company, and reached a conclusion. They must have run. He stripped them of their weapons and sent them back in disgrace, depriving the battalion of the only men with actual combat experience it possessed. Cameron had encountered a textbook fighting withdrawal executed under sustained pressure against vastly superior numbers by men who had been in the jungle for 2 weeks, and he read it as cowardice because the men who had done it looked like men who had been fighting in a jungle for 2 weeks. It was not the last time in the Kokoda campaign that this misreading would be made by someone who had not been present for the thing they were misreading. There is an event in the history of the 39th Battalion that does not fit any available military category and must be understood on its own terms. In the days between the withdrawal to Isurava and the opening of the main Japanese assault in late August, a number of the battalion's wounded had been brought to the regimental aid post at Isurava. These men had done what they had been asked to do. They had fought at Awala and at Oivi and at Kokoda and at Deniki and in the fighting approaches to Isurava. And the fighting had taken from them what fighting takes. They were on stretchers, waiting to be evacuated toward Port Moresby. They were, in every technical military sense, out of the fight. Then word came through that the rearguard units holding the track south of the Australian position were in desperate straits. They needed more men. The only men available were the ones on the stretchers. One by one, every man at that regimental aid post who could still walk picked up his rifle and went back toward the fighting. Not under orders. Not under threat. Not because a regulation required it, or a superior officer had decided it. Because the rear guard needed them and they could still move. The wounded men of the 39th Australian Infantry Battalion, the chocolate soldiers, the koalas, the men Major Cameron had concluded had run, walked back into the battle they had already been counted out of, in a jungle they had been in for weeks, carrying wounds they had earned in previous fighting, because that was the kind of soldiers they were. The rearguard's resistance, reinforced by men who had no business being there, forced the Japanese to stop their advance and reorganize for a more deliberate assault on the main position at Isurava. That reorganization created a lull of approximately 2 weeks. Time in which the first companies of the 2nd 14th Battalion, AIF soldiers returning from the Middle East, could make their way up the track and arrive before the main Japanese assault began. Time in which a new commanding officer could fly into Port Moresby and start the walk toward the men he had been sent to command. In the Kokoda campaign in August of 1942, 2 weeks was the difference between the Australian position being destroyed before help arrived, and the Australian position surviving long enough for help to matter. The men Cameron had stripped of their weapons at Deniki for what he judged to be cowardice had just created that margin with their own bodies, voluntarily, without being asked. These men were not chocolate soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Hyacinth Ralph Honor was born on the 17th of August, 1904, in Fremantle, Western Australia. He did not use his first name, which communicates something about his economy of manner that his official record does not quite capture. He had trained as a lawyer before the war. He had fought in Greece and on Crete with the 211th Battalion, been awarded the Military Cross for his actions at Derna in Libya, escaped to Alexandria when Crete fell, returned to Australia, was briefly reunited with his wife, was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and was sent to Papua. He arrived at Isurava on the 16th of August, 1942, and assumed command of the 39th Battalion. He was 37 years old, the same age William Owen had been when he died at Kokoda. The battalion Hunter found at Isurava had been fighting for nearly 4 weeks, in conditions that stripped away everything except the fundamental question of whether a man would hold or break. His assessment was recorded afterwards and should be read in its exact words. Physically, the pathetically young warriors of the 39th were in poor shape, worn out by strenuous fighting and exhausting movement, and weakened by lack of food and sleep and shelter. Many had literally come to a standstill. He did not send them back. An officer of lesser experience might have concluded that a battalion in this condition was finished. Honor concluded the opposite. He held them in position and prepared for what he could hear assembling in the jungle to the north. His method was quiet authority rather than bluster. He told the men he knew them because he recognized what they had already done. A man who has fought does not need from a new commanding officer to be told he is exceptional. He needs to be told his effort was seen. The critical decision Honor made in the days before the assault concerned the 2nd 14th Battalion, AIF veterans arriving up the track, ostensibly to relieve the 39th. The correct procedure was to relieve the exhausted militia and replace them with fresh troops. Honor looked at the position, at the ground, at the distances and the approach routes through the jungle, and reached a different conclusion. A single battalion, even a fresh AIF battalion, would not be sufficient for what was coming. He kept the 39th in reserve, positioned on the flanks, available to be committed at the points where pressure threatened to break the line. He was making a bet on men already at their limit, and his experience in the Mediterranean had told him something about what men at their limit were capable of when the alternative was unambiguous. Brigadier Arnold Potts assumed command of Maroubra Force on the 23rd of August, the wider formation of which the 39th and 2nd 14th formed the Fighting Corps. His tactical skill in the fighting withdrawal that followed would preserve the Australian force from destruction. It would cost him his career. From Melbourne, General Douglas MacArthur had told Prime Minister Curtin that if Australian troops would not fight, 100,000 of them would be no good. He was describing men who had been fighting continuously for nearly a month under sustained attack, with inadequate rations and equipment, and without the reinforcement that adequate planning would have delivered weeks earlier. MacArthur's comfortable assessment and the physical reality of Honor's Isurava were separated by more than the kilometres between them. The assault Honor was now preparing for would settle the question of what the 39th were worth. It came on the morning of the 26th of August. The main body of the Nankai Shitai had arrived at the Buna beachhead on the 17th and 18th of August. Yoriwa had force-marched his men 120 kilometres from Buna to Isurava in a week, under full combat loads, over terrain that the forced march was steadily destroying. Many soldiers fell out and failed to arrive before the battle began. The formation that assembled north of the Australian position at Isurava numbered approximately 3,000 men. Not 6,000. Not the vast horde of overwhelming numerical superiority that the legend of the Kokoda campaign would later require. Approximately 3,000 men against approximately 2,290 Australians, counting the 39th, elements of the 49th and 53rd, the arriving companies of the 2nd 14th, and attached headquarters and support personnel. Closer, in the cold arithmetic, than either side knew or would later readily acknowledge. Yoriwa's plan was the double envelopment, his 4 infantry battalions attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. One battalion held in reserve for the pursuit he expected would follow the destruction of the Australian force. A separate flanking battalion was sent on a wide arc well around the Australian left, tasked with emerging behind the position at Alola and cutting the track south. It became so completely lost in the jungle that it navigated away from every position it needed to reach. The commander of that battalion said afterwards, "At Isurava, we didn't fire a shot or lose a man." The Owen Stanley Range had claimed his tactical plan without requiring anyone to stop it. The assault opened on the 26th of August with the mountain guns, the 70mm howitzers Yoriwa had hauled across the range, beginning their work on the Australian positions. Most of the 39th soldiers had never experienced artillery fire before. They stayed in their positions. The 2nd 14th's veterans had been shelled in the Western Desert and on Crete, and knew the specific discipline that surviving artillery requires. They stayed in theirs. Japanese infantry surged against the perimeter in waves throughout the afternoon and evening, probing for weaknesses. The Australians held, poured fire into the attacking waves, drove them back, and held again. Night did not stop the attacks. The pattern repeated into a second day and a third, with the mechanical persistence of an enemy who had numbers enough to rotate his forces and keep pressure continuous, while the defence had no rotation available. Honor fed the 39th into the line at the points where it threatened to break. Each time a section of the 2nd 14th's perimeter was overwhelmed, men from the Militia Reserve, exhausted, many carrying wounds from previous engagements, went forward and held it. This was the decision Honor had made, and kept against the conventional doctrine that said the exhausted battalion should have been relieved. On the morning of the 29th of August, the Japanese found the gap they had been working toward. C Company of the 2nd 14th Battalion, holding the right flank, broke under a concentrated assault. Japanese soldiers poured through the breach. Battalion headquarters was directly ahead and threatened. The entire Isurava Ridge was in danger of collapsing from the right in the next 15 minutes. Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury was born on the 8th of January 1918 in Melbourne. His best friend since childhood was a man named Alan Avery, and the two of them had in their youth walked the 400 kilometres from Melbourne to Sydney on foot, for no reason except that it seemed worth doing. Kingsbury had enlisted in 1940. He had fought in the Middle East, in Greece, Crete, and the North African desert. By the morning of the 29th of August, he was one of the few survivors of a platoon that had already been overrun and destroyed in the first days of the Isurava fighting. He had lost most of the men he had served alongside for 2 years. He was 24 years old. He was on a ridge in Papua, and the right flank of the Australian position was collapsing. Kingsbury picked up a Bren gun. He did not advance in the approved manner. He rushed forward, firing the Bren from the hip through direct enemy machine gun fire, running into the gap the Japanese were streaming through, and sweeping it with sustained fire while he moved. Eyewitnesses on both sides of the fighting described the effect on the Japanese advance as immediate and complete. The momentum stopped. The breakthrough was closed. The right flank held. A Japanese sniper killed him. Bruce Steele Kingsbury was 24 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the only Victoria Cross for action on the Kokoda Track itself. No monument to him has ever been raised in any Australian city. The battle continued. Japanese attacks resumed on the 30th and 31st of August with unchanged intensity and were held with unchanged determination. Horii's reserve battalion, the one kept fresh for the pursuit of the broken enemy, had been committed to the fighting on the 29th, when Horii concluded the attack would fail without it. Of his 4 infantry battalions, the one designated to chase down the fleeing Australians was now inside the battle itself, and the Australians had not fled. Over the 4 days from the 25th to the 31st of August, the Australians lost 99 killed and 111 wounded. The Japanese lost 140 killed and 231 wounded. Numbers that sit close to parity. Not the overwhelming disproportion the legend requires. Closer than either side knew. Horii had failed in his primary objective. He had not destroyed the Australian force before it could withdraw. The 39th Battalion, which had begun the campaign at approximately 1,500 all ranks, mustered approximately 185 effective soldiers when they were finally relieved from the line. What happened next was called many things. Retreat was the most common word. Rabbits was another. The fighting withdrawal from Isurava to Amita Ridge lasted through most of September 1942, and it was conducted in conditions that made Isurava look, in retrospect, like the phase of the campaign when things had been straightforward. At Afogi and Brigade Hill in the first week of September, Brigadier Potts's force came closer to destruction than at any previous point. The ground at Brigade Hill did not offer the natural advantages Isurava had provided, and Japanese flanking manoeuvres moved through the vegetation faster than the Australians could reposition to counter them. On the 7th and 8th of September, the entire Maroubra force was nearly encircled. The gap between the Japanese flanking column and the track south was measured in minutes rather than hours. The difference between an orderly withdrawal and a catastrophe was the particular stubbornness of men who had been doing this for 6 weeks and understood exactly how little margin they were working within. They cleared the gap. The withdrawal continued. On the 6th of September, at the village of Minari, the 39th Battalion was being relieved from the line for the last time in this phase of the campaign. Honor assembled them. The men who gathered in front of him were not the men who had left Port Moresby in July. They were leaner, darker, quieter, carrying the specific weight of men who have made decisions that do not appear in training manuals and are not covered by any language the institution provides for what soldiers are supposed to feel. Now, I don't know a lot of you by name, he told them, but I know you. We met at Isurava. We fought there together, and every step of the way here. The battle we fought for the track may have just saved your nation. At Imita, we will stop him. It was, measured against every official communication produced about the Kokoda campaign in 1942, the most accurate single assessment on record. It was also the only one not subsequently deployed in the service of someone's career. The official communications were being generated in Melbourne, and they had a different character. MacArthur had pressed curtain throughout the withdrawal, demanding Blamey take personal command in New Guinea. The United States Air Force in Port Moresby was ordered to prepare for evacuation. General Sir Thomas Blamey arrived in New Guinea with the task of demonstrating that somebody was doing something. He sacked General Rowell. He sacked Brigadier Potts. He sacked Major General Allen. He moved through the available senior officers with the efficiency of a man who needed scapegoats more urgently than he needed an accurate understanding of what had actually occurred. Then, at the parade ground at Koitaki Plantation, he assembled the veterans of the 216th Battalion, men who had fought the rearguard from Isurava to Imita Ridge, and told them they had been running like rabbits. Lieutenant Colonel Honor was standing in that parade. Blamey looked across the ranks without recognition. Honor recalled it afterwards. He didn't know who I was. I had been his commander of the Australian forces opposing the Japanese. He didn't know. He didn't care. The 216th's Padre said publicly what the men could not. These were the men who had saved Australia despite Blamey's mistakes. It was accurate. It changed nothing. The withdrawal to Imita Ridge on the 16th of September shortened the Australian supply chain, extended the Japanese one, and brought Australian heavy artillery into range of the Japanese positions for the first time in the entire campaign. The men who were accused of running had just handed the tactical initiative to the force pursuing them. One further fact belongs in this record. It was not on the Kokoda Track that Japan sustained its first land defeat of the entire Pacific War. That was at Milne Bay, on the eastern tip of Papua, in early September of 1942, where the Australian 18th Brigade defeated a Japanese amphibious landing force and drove it back into the sea. The track campaign bought the time the war required. Milne Bay broke the pattern of Japanese invincibility on the ground first, and that fact deserves its sentence alongside the rest. On the 16th of September, the Nankai Shitai reached Yoriwa. The 1,500 men who remained effective from the 6,000 who had crossed the Owen Stanleys celebrated what they could see from the ridge. Hori's orders told him something his celebrating officers did not yet know. The celebrations were premature. The withdrawal order arrived on the 23rd of September, 1942. It came from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo and required Hori to abandon everything his men had spent 2 months bleeding for and pull back to the north coast. The reason was Guadalcanal. American Marines had landed there in August, and the Japanese position on the island was deteriorating faster than the forces available could manage. Imperial GHQ had concluded that simultaneous major offensive operations in Papua and Guadalcanal exceeded Japan's current capacity. A second message from Imperial General Headquarters itself was required before Hori accepted the order as irrevocable. The difficulty was not the strategic decision. The difficulty was what the Japanese Army's culture made it possible to say about that decision. The Imperial Japanese Army had no functional concept of retreat. It had been expunged from the military idiom by decades of doctrinal emphasis on offensive action, on the primacy of attack, on the impossibility of withdrawal as a legitimate military act. The word itself existed in the language, but had been so thoroughly removed from military communications that using it was impermissible. Hori's commanders offered instead a formulation that preserved the ideological architecture while abandoning the tactical position. His forces would advance to the rear. They would change their marching direction. The Japanese army had no plan for retreat, because retreat had been conceptually eliminated from the institution's self-understanding, and what could not be conceived of institutionally could not be planned for. Hori's men on the ridge, told the morning after the order arrived that they were reversing their direction of march, were shocked in the specific way that men are shocked when the premise of everything they have endured is removed without warning. They were starving. They were sick. They had left 1,000 of their comrades dead on the track behind them. They could see the city they had bled for. And now they were walking back, described in language their institution had invented specifically to prevent the word retreat from being used. In Tokyo, the reports from Papua required management that the standard military communications apparatus was already equipped to provide. The pattern had been established after Midway in June of 1942. When Japan had suffered a naval catastrophe, its domestic population was never accurately informed of. Defeats were reframed as strategic positioning. Casualty figures were suppressed or fabricated. The domestic press had neither the access nor the institutional freedom to challenge the official account. By 1943, the army would formalize a new word, tenshin, meaning approximately march elsewhere, to accomplish the specific function of describing retreat without the word that meant retreat. Those reports could not be published in Japan. An elite, undefeated formation had been stopped and reversed by soldiers. Japan's own military had assessed as militia conscripts unsuitable for serious combat. Boys from Victoria, with an average age of 18 and a half, equipped with obsolete weapons, digging their first defensive positions with bully beef tins and helmets, because nobody had provided entrenching tools. The reports confirming this were classified. The withdrawal was reframed. The home front was not informed. When the Australians advanced north from Umita Ridge on the 28th of September, they found the Yoriwa positions empty. The Japanese had withdrawn in the night. The pursuit was not clean. The Japanese rearguard withdrew with the skill of soldiers who had not forgotten their trade, simply because the campaign had reversed. At Templeton's Crossing and along Yora Creek in October, the rearguard positions were prepared and defended with the determination of men who understood that every day they held the Australians slowed the advance on the Boona beachhead. The fighting at Yora Creek lasted more than 2 weeks and cost the Australians significant casualties. A retreating army can still kill. On the 2nd of November, 1942, Australian troops walked back into Kokoda. The flag went up over the village where Owen had thrown grenades and been shot above the right eye on the 29th of July, where Vernon had operated by lantern light in a hut, while the battle continued outside, where the supply aircraft had circled and turned back rather than land. The campaign on the track itself was over. The Australians who returned to Kokoda that November day had covered the same 96 kilometres twice. The final engagement of the track campaign was fought at Oivigarari, east of Kokoda, between the 4th and 11th of November. The 7th Division, under Major General George Vasey, encircled the Nankai Shitai headquarters and the remnant of its main force, approximately 2,800 men, all that remained effective from 13,500. The encirclement held. The well-ordered withdrawal Hori had planned disintegrated into something the language of orderly retirement could not accommodate. On the 18th of November, Major General Tomitaro Horii attempted to navigate the flooded Kumusi River on an improvised raft with his orderly and his chief of staff. The river was in flood, running fast, carrying debris from the range above. The raft snagged on a submerged tree. The 3 men transferred to a canoe found on the riverbank. The canoe was swept out to sea off the New Guinea coast and capsized in a thunderstorm. His orderly survived. Hori's last words, as the orderly recorded them: "I haven't the strength to swim any further. Tell the troops that Hori died here. Long live the Emperor." His body was never recovered. He was 52 years old. He had expressed private doubts about the overland plan before it began, been told to execute it anyway, and died in the river of the territory the plan required him to cross. The battles at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda on the North Papua coast continued from November through January of 1943. Australian and American forces fighting through the Japanese beachhead defences until the last position was cleared. Total Japanese deaths in Papua from the opening of the campaign to its conclusion exceeded 10,000. Tokyo's system for managing the news from Papua was operational before the reports arrived. Accurate information about military reverses was classified, replaced in official channels with accounts that attributed what had occurred to strategic calculation rather than enemy action, and withheld from the domestic population through a press structure with no independent access and no institutional freedom to question what it was told. The Nankai Shitai's withdrawal was described as a strategic repositioning, a decision taken in light of broader operational considerations. The specific substance of those reports, an undefeated elite formation stopped and reversed by militia conscripts, whom Japan's own military had assessed as too soft for serious combat, was not published. The language the Imperial Army had developed for exactly this purpose served its function. Advances to the rear. Changes of marching direction. The home front was not informed. On the Australian side, something structurally similar was occurring, though far less widely observed at the time. General Douglas MacArthur controlled all media reporting from the Southwest Pacific Theatre. The coverage the Australian public received was filtered through machinery that attributed successes to American leadership and setbacks to Australian failure. The 39th Battalion's role in buying the time the campaign required was not the story that apparatus produced. The story it produced was the one Blamey had delivered at Koitaki, that the Australians had run, that the solution was firm senior command, that the outcome represented the correction of a failure rather than the culmination of what the militia had done across 7 weeks of fighting, that nobody at the top of the chain had adequately planned for. That version persisted. It shaped public understanding of the campaign for decades. The 39th Battalion returned to the fighting at Gona on the north coast in November and December of 1942, and held its ground there too. It was disbanded on the 3rd of July, 1943. Its personnel were redistributed to other units. Its identity was dissolved into the army it had helped to preserve. The Victoria Cross awarded for action on the Kokoda Track went to Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 2nd 14th Battalion. Kingsbury earned it, without qualification or reservation, and the cross honours his memory as it should. The point is not that the wrong man received it. The point is that it was the only Victoria Cross for action on the track, and the men of the 39th, who had been on the track from the first engagement to the last, received no equivalent. Their formal recognition, as a battalion, was a disbanding order. Ralph Honor died on the 14th of May, 1994, aged 89. The man who had told the 39th at Minari that the battle they had fought may have just saved their nation had been right. The record of the campaign did not find, in his lifetime, an adequate way to say so formally. In 2002, 60 years after the battle, the Prime Ministers of Australia and Papua New Guinea unveiled a memorial at Isurava, on the ground where the fighting had been. 4 black granite pillars, standing on the ridge, where the 39th had held the line and Kingsbury had charged with his Bren gun. Each pillar bears a single word: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. The words were chosen by men who had been there. They are the most economical true statement the language permits about what happened at Isurava in the last days of August 1942. The pillars do not say that the men who stood where those pillars now stand had been called chocolate soldiers by their own side, accused of running by a general who did not recognize their commanding officer, and disbanded by an army that redistributed their strength without formally acknowledging what they had done with it. The Japanese officers on the Yoriwa Ridge in the first week of September 1942 were looking at a prize they had already lost. They did not know that yet. The men who remained effective from the 6,000 who had crossed the Owen Stanleys were looking at lights that were further away than any map could show, because the men between them and those lights had spent 7 weeks demonstrating that the map was not the territory. William Owen was 37 when he died in the lantern light of Doc Vernon's improvised surgery, still warm from throwing grenades that could not hold the position. Sam Templeton was 42 when he laughed at the man who was about to kill him near the village of Oivi. And that laughter is the most accurate biographical detail the record has preserved about who he was. Bruce Kingsbury was 24 when he rushed through machine gun fire with a Bren gun and closed a breach in the line with his body, and was killed by a sniper in the moment after it closed. And the ground where he fell now has 4 granite pillars on it that say courage and endurance and mateship and sacrifice, without using the words chocolate soldiers. Tokyo suppressed confirmation that the Nankai Shitai had been stopped by boys from Victoria, whose army had given them obsolete equipment, sent them up a mountain track in the wrong uniforms, and assured the public they were not worth taking seriously. The reports were managed. The withdrawal was reframed. The home front was not informed. And on the Australian side, the men who had made the time were told by a general who could not recognise their commanding officer that they had been running like rabbits. The 185 who walked out of 1,500 were disbanded on the 3rd of July, 1943. No monument to them stands in any Australian city. Their 4 pillars are in a jungle at Isurava, on the ground where they earned them. The distance between what those men did across the 7 weeks from Awala to the withdrawal south, and what the record of their own side chose to say about it, is the distance in which the real history of the Kokoda campaign is written. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand why the finest soldiering so often goes unrecorded by the institutions that benefited from it, watch this next.